There's a moment during certain traffic stops when everything changes. And most drivers don't even realize it until it's already too late. You're sitting there. The stop has gone on longer than you expected. The officer has asked a few more questions than usual. Maybe another unit has arrived. And then suddenly, a K9 is brought to the scene, and right there, the entire situation shifts. Not because you said anything new, not because you did anything dramatic, but because now, the legal threshold for what officers can do next may be very different. And here's the part that catches people off guard. When that K9 alerts, most drivers panic, talk too much, or try to explain things in a way that actually makes their situation worse. So let me ask you something honestly. If a police dog circled your car during a traffic stop and the officer suddenly said the K9 alerted, would you know exactly what to say in that moment? Or would you start explaining yourself without even realizing what just changed? I want you to answer that in the comments, because this is one of those moments where silence, clarity, and timing matter more than anything else. Now stay with me, because what I'm about to explain is not something most people understand correctly. There are a lot of myths around K9 units, a lot of bad advice online. And if you follow the wrong approach in that moment, you can turn a manageable situation into something much more serious. So let's break this down carefully. First, you need to understand what a K9 alert actually means in the context of a traffic stop. Officers use trained detection dogs to identify the scent of specific substances. When a dog alerts, the officer interprets that behavior as a signal that the dog has detected something it was trained to find. Now here's where things get important. That alert can be used as a legal justification for a search of your vehicle in many situations. But, and this is critical, that doesn't mean everything about the situation is automatically unquestionable. Because what happens next, and how you respond, still matters. Now let's go step by step through how this situation usually unfolds. You're stopped. The officer has already completed the basic part of the traffic stop, or at least it feels that way. Then they extend the interaction. Maybe they say they're waiting on something. Maybe they keep asking questions. And then the K9 arrives. At this point, many drivers make their first mistake. They become nervous, they start talking more, they try to explain things before anything has even happened. But here's the truth. Talking at this stage does not help you. It often does the opposite. Because once a K9 is involved, the focus is no longer on your explanation. It's on observation, procedure, and what the dog does. Now the K9 circles the vehicle. The officer watches closely. And then they say it. The dog alerted. That's the moment, the turning point. And this is where most people lose control of the situation, and not physically, but verbally. They panic. They say things like, "There's nothing in there, I swear. That dog is wrong. I don't know why it did that." And without realizing it, they start digging themselves into a deeper situation, because now they're reacting emotionally, instead of responding strategically. So what should you actually say? Not something complicated, not something aggressive, not something that sounds like you're trying to argue with the officer. You stay calm, you keep your tone steady, and you say, "I do not consent to any searches." Now listen carefully, because this is where people get confused. Saying this does not stop the search if the officer has legal grounds. If the alert is accepted as probable cause, the search may proceed regardless of your consent. So why say it? Because it protects you. It makes it clear that you are not giving permission, and that distinction matters later, far more than it feels like it does in the moment. Now let's go deeper into why this matters. Consent and probable cause are not the same thing. Consent is you giving permission. Probable cause is the officer relying on a legal justification. If you give consent, you remove a layer of protection for yourself. If you do not consent, the officer must rely entirely on their legal justification, and that difference can become critical if the situation is reviewed later. Now let's talk about another mistake people make right after saying those words. They say, "I do not consent to any searches." And then they keep talking. They explain, they defend, they try to convince the officer. That defeats the purpose. Because once you've made your position clear, the smartest move is to stop talking. You don't argue on the roadside. You don't try to prove anything in that moment, because that's not where outcomes are decided. Now let's walk through a realistic scenario so you can see how this plays out. You're driving. You get pulled over, everything starts normally. You provide your documents, you keep your tone calm. The officer asks a few questions. You don't over-explain. Now time passes. The stop feels longer than expected. Another unit arrives, then the K9. At this point, you stay aware, but you don't panic. You don't start talking. You don't react emotionally. The dog circles the vehicle. The officer watches. Then they say, "The dog alerted." Now this is your moment. Instead of reacting, you respond calmly. "I do not consent to any searches." Clear, direct, no attitude. Now whatever happens next, you've done your part correctly. If the officer proceeds with a search, you do not interfere. You do not argue physically. You do not escalate. You simply remain calm. Because everything from this point forward is being observed, documented, and potentially reviewed later. Now here's something I want you to really think about. Most people believe the most important part of a traffic stop is what happens in the moment. But in situations like this, what matters just as much is what happens after. How things are interpreted, how procedures are reviewed, how decisions are justified. And that's why your words matter, because they become part of that record. Now let's address something else that creates confusion. People think that if they stay completely silent from the beginning, they're protected. But silence without clarity can be misunderstood. That's why it's important to clearly state your position when it matters. "I do not consent to any searches." That sentence is not emotional, it's not aggressive, it's precise. And precision is what protects you. Now let's talk about tone again, because this cannot be overstated. You can say the exact right words, but if your tone is wrong, the situation can still escalate. If you sound angry, sarcastic, or confrontational, the interaction changes. But if you stay calm, steady, and respectful, the situation remains controlled, and control is what you want. Now here's the bigger picture. A K9 alert is one of those moments where the balance of the stop shifts, not completely out of your hands, but into a more structured, serious phase. And in that phase, your role is not to fight the process. It's to move through it correctly, because the roadside is not where you win or lose a case. It's where you either protect yourself or accidentally create problems. Now imagine two different drivers in this exact situation. One panics, starts talking, argues with the officer, tries to explain everything. The other stays calm, says, "I do not consent to any searches," and then remains quiet. Same situation, different outcomes, not necessarily in that moment, but in everything that follows. Because one created a record full of emotional reactions, and the other created a record of clarity and control. Now let's bring this back to you, because this is where it matters. If you ever find yourself in that moment, a K9 at your vehicle, an officer saying the dog alerted, you won't panic. You won't guess. You won't try to talk your way out of it. You'll stay calm. You'll understand exactly what just changed, and you'll respond with the one thing that actually protects you in that moment. Clarity. "I do not consent to any searches." And then you let the situation move forward, without adding anything that could make it worse. Because at the end of the day, it's not about stopping what's already in motion. It's about making sure you don't make it harder for yourself, while it is.